Hi, I'm Dr. Aaron Goodson, and you're tuned into The Cover with Kaz Brown.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Cover. I am your host, Kaz Brown, and today we have a very special guest, Dr. Aaron Goodson, Assistant Director of Counseling and Sports Psychology at Mississippi State University. So Dr. Goodson, I just want to thank you first and foremost for joining us today. And I would just like you to start off kind of by explaining to our viewers what your position is and what exactly you do for the athletic department.
Absolutely. And thank you, Kaz, for reaching out and having me on here. I am honored to be on here and excited to dive into this discussion that we're going to have. In my role as Assistant Director of Counseling and Sports Psychology, I am an embedded counselor in the athletic department here at Mississippi State. And my director and I happen to be dually trained. And so what that means is that we're trained to address the sport performance enhancement, mental skills training, kind of more in-sport type of things of how you train and compete better and maximize your time in that regard. But we're also trained as clinical counselors to address some of the personal growth, development, and other issues that may arise in the student-athlete experience. And as you can imagine, some of those might be connected to different team dynamics and interpersonal things, as college is such a transformative time for student athletes. But things could also be connected to what's going on at home, what's going on in the university in general, in the country, in the world, et cetera. And so with that dual training, we provide holistic support and services for our student athletes.
Awesome. And I just want to talk about like mental health in general, because I think that's such a taboo subject, but especially in sports. And so why do you think that is, or where does that stem from exactly?
Yeah, so I think a large part of it is just how we understand and conceptualize sport in our society. We conceptualize it as a space where people are able to work through and persist through anything where our toughness and our strength and our domination is to be shown and is to be celebrated. We are taught to kind of shun anything else. And so when you put mental health into that perspective and talk about it, how it exists on a spectrum, so there's wellness all the way to illness and everything in between, then those things sometimes fly in the face of each other. So people believe in this context of sport that there is no room for struggle. There is no room for, I don't want to use the term weakness, but there's no space really to work through and struggle through something the way it may present in a mental health context. And so more often than not, I think it leads to kind of this butting of heads that occurs from time to time. I think that's magnified when you talk about the level and the intensity of sport. And so when we talk about the notion of collegiate or professional sport, people have this assumption as you get higher that there is this strength to be able to work through, or that you're immune to having certain issues happen to you or things of that nature. And I think that really contributes to the stigma that exists around mental health when we look at it in the sporting context.
Absolutely. And you kind of touched on this just as far as the kind of no excuses or no weakness mantra that exists in sports, especially as you get into the collegiate and the professional level. So my question for you is, can those two mindsets exist? Can the no excuses, push through it, work through it mindset that kind of has always existed in sports, can that coexist with also, taking care of your mental health and prioritizing mental health?
Yeah, I absolutely do believe they can coexist. I think it takes a lot of work for them to do so, though. When we talk about the coexisting, I think we are really talking about this notion of ensuring that we're, ensuring that we're meeting people where they are, and checking ourselves, checking maybe our own biases and being aware of our own experiences and kind of things that we're bringing into the situation that helps color how we interact with students, as students interact with each other, as coaches interact with students, as students interact with coaches, and really open up the space and the door for open and honest communication where standards can be present, as well as an open acknowledgement of the things that may come up that student athletes are working through. And I think only with that open and honest communication can there be a point where we're working towards this notion, this space where they can coexist. These high standards of really pushing oneself, making lots of sacrifices, things of that nature, and ensuring that this is done in a way that ensures and protects the physical and mental health of student athletes as much as possible. So it's definitely something that's feasible. In my experience, it takes a lot of work to get there, and
Right.
that can lead to people having differing experiences with it.
Absolutely. And I know that this is a topic that is pretty personal to you as you were a student athlete yourself. So I just want to talk about from your experience as a student athlete to where you are now on working on the other side of things. How have those conversations changed, you know, from when you were a student athlete in school to now you're on the other side of things? You know, is there more dialogue? Is it more open? What's it look like throughout your career?
Yeah, I've seen a tremendous amount of change. I'm not going to date myself and tell you how long ago I was competing, but I will say that it wasn't that long ago. And so what I've seen in the time between me competing as a student athlete and transitioning out of that to going through my graduate education and training and being in this space now is really the way that awareness around mental health has been highlighted, and kind of the broader culture and context of, you know, the United States, the world, and then particularly for, um, I would say, folks that are really just 18 and younger. You know, I think that is because it's a more common conversation. We see it in different places in pop culture. We see it in different places, um, movies, TV shows, talk show hosts talking about it. All of these things that has helped really elevate how the conversation can exist. I think for collegiate student athletes, and that's what I see happen the most in my experience. One of the things that I tell people is that I remember when I first became interested in sports psychology in undergrad, and even early in my time as a graduate student, looking at the positions that existed in collegiate athletic departments and professional sport organizations, and really thinking about how folks who would be coming out of school at that time may just really have to sell themselves or sell the need for their services to different administrators, different owners, and things of that nature. And in such a short time, we're really seeing that dynamic shift where a large number of collegiate athletic departments are making an investment to either have somebody embedded in their athletic department to strengthen the connection they have with the on-campus counseling center, to be willing to contract out someone who provides mental health services. And it's been really, really interesting to see that, because I think it's still early enough in the process where we're still learning and seeing the benefits of having these strong relationships and infusing mental health into everything that we do. We recognize its importance, but I think we're still at the point where administrators and some other folks are really looking to see its value in a tangible way. But then at the same time, have this place where, like, I know it's important. I know that I need to figure it out. And so where the clinicians come in is not only working with student athletes, but helping bridge that gap between the lack of knowledge that some administrators, some coaches, some other support staff might have around mental health, because these are also individuals that are interacting with the student athlete on the sometimes daily basis. So it's been incredible to see the change, quite honestly, Kaz, and just even seeing how it's continuing to occur. I know there's room to grow, but it's been really awesome to see just in the short time from myself competing to now being able to provide these services to student athletes in the midst of their competition days.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you kind of touched on like how there still is some sort of maybe a disconnect between like administrators or coaches or like seeing the need or the value for this. And I know like I've just had conversations with some of my friends who are also collegiate athletes. And, you know, I think the common theme there was we would be presented a list or, hey, this is where, you know, here's a list of resources or a place you can go on campus if you need help. And then, you know, okay, we got the piece of paper. Now it's time to go to practice. Right. So I think that's kind of like that. I just noticed was like a common theme within like my group of friends and kind of what we talked about. So how do we bridge that gap, I guess?
Yeah, so I think we can bridge in a number of different ways. One of the things that we do here on our campus, and that I know a lot of folks do at their campus, is to, a lot of people use the term like fight the stigma. And I like that term, but I tend to lean more into normalize the presence. And so what that means is not only being around, just observing practices and competitions, but then also working with coaches to, if there is space for doing some performance enhancement work or space to have a conversation around a mental health topic, that is tied into practice. So it's not seen as this additional thing, this outside thing that you can't quite see or you can't quite put your hands on. And that I think goes a really long way with our student athletes across the country. For student athletes at institutions that have an embedded practitioner, those practitioners having that face time at practices and competitions really goes a long way in terms of just reassuring that I'm not just there for you when or if something goes wrong. We have a saying in our department, and it's a common saying I've heard used at IMG Sports Academy and just other places: you don't have to be sick to get better. And I think that's a really, really important component when we talk about normalizing the presence of mental health clinicians, sports psychologists, or whatever name you may use, just to provide that mental health and wellness support for student athletes. So if you can normalize it and kind of infuse it into the things that already exist, then I think we're going a really long way as compared to waiting until a crisis or waiting until something happens, and that being one of the few times you see one of those individuals present and interacting with your team or with yourself as an individual.
Definitely. And I like how you talked about like embedding it into practices and things, because that is something that when I was my first year professionally in Germany, actually, we worked with a sports psych, and they were like at practices every like so often. And then they would kind of like come in and kind of embed that mental health training along with the physical training, which I thought was super, super helpful. I kind of want to go back to a point that you touched on, and just mental health being talked about more in pop culture and popular figures, and especially in sports. I mean, there's stars like Kevin Love and DeMar DeRozan who have really made it their mission to kind of normalize it and open up the door to have that conversation. So how impactful do you think that is for the next generation of up and coming athletes?
I think it's tremendously impactful. When I look at where I am in collegiate athletics, and I look kind of in both directions, for lack of a better term. So I look at like younger athletes from high school on down, and then I look at next level where you're talking about, professional, Olympic, other levels of kind of elite athletic competition. What tends to happen is what happens in these higher ends or these higher levels of competition are mirrored as you go lower. So to have someone on a stage that large, competing at that level, to be openly talking about the importance and the value of mental health goes a really long way. I think it empowers individuals to be able to speak to their own story, to be able to seek help. And I think that in addition to that going a long way, it's not the only thing that needs to be done, right? So I think the other half that we're still in the process of doing is having those in administration and front office positions and things of that nature hear this and then start to put the investment in those kinds of things, right? The whole old notion of put your money where your mouth is. So to say like, hey, I hear you, I support you, I see that there's value in this. And then really, each organization, each athletic department, each, even when getting out to the high school level, school figuring out what does it mean to be able to provide tangible mental health support for our athletes. Is it, if you only have the resources to bring someone in one time or just to provide some free resources for folks to access information, good. If you have the funding to contract somebody, but you can only get a set number of kind of sessions or something, good. If you have the resources to really have someone in your organization embedded in a part of your staff, even better. But I think it's both of those things, right? The value and the impact of really speaking out as any athlete, I would say. I think the higher level athletes have a little bit more impact. And then with that, this onus and this responsibility is kind of on those in decision-making positions and investment positions to be able to hear what's being shared and then take that and really make it real, make it tangible for those that are voicing this need and voicing this value to help them not only compete and perform better, but to just hopefully grow and develop to be better human beings.
Yes, absolutely. And you touched on kind of how everybody has to have their own outline or plan, kind of depending on what their funding or resources look like. So my next question, I think kind of your answer will probably depend on that as well. But what are sort of like the basic things that all teams right now could be doing, you know, given everything that's going on in our world? What are some of the basic or like foundational type things that teams can be doing at this moment to make sure that their athletes are in the right headspace to compete?
Yeah. Whew, that's a big question. Couple of things. I kind of have a multi-pronged approach in my head, if that makes sense. So I think the first thing is from a coach's perspective, or even from an athlete's perspective, there's real value in having the space to talk about this. And I even hesitate to use the word talk, express yourself around what's going on, because not everybody's a verbal person. So I think as a coach, working to establish, create, maintain a culture where conversations like this can be held, whether it is an individual athlete feeling comfortable enough to come to the coach, or for the athletes to have the conversation themselves, or to talk in small groups. I think the next step then is, as a coach, there's got to be an increased awareness around what providing support from a mental health standpoint looks like, even if that's not you. Right? So I'm not asking all coaches to become experts in all things mental health, or even a few things mental health, or even a few things social injustice, or other larger issues that are happening. But I do think that it's their responsibility to have an idea about somebody who can provide that support to their student athletes, to their, you know, athletes, their professional athletes. If not me, I know someone that I can connect you to, or something I can connect you to help provide you that support. So if you're not creating the culture, then knowing how to then plug people in and connect people to that information. And then if you're not sure about that, then kind of doing your homework. I know that's a phrase that's been used pretty commonly around a number of things going on in the world. And I think just kind of thinking about the mental health and well-being of athletes in the midst of all that's going on in the world, there's a lot out there right now from a simple Google search. So really just reading that, figuring that out. Not only what does it look like for me, but even if you don't know, just taking that information in and observing what is already present in your space and the culture that you've created.
Right.
Yeah, there's just a number of different ways, and it's really a matter of kind of getting in where you fit in, for lack of a better term.
So you talked about, you know, how kind of this is a conversation that kind of stems from a lot of different directions. So my question for you, and I think this is kind of one of those like matters of subject as well, but does it have to start with administrators down to coaches, down to athletes? Does it need to start with athletes going to their coaches and saying, hey, I'm not in a good space right now, I need someone I can talk to? You know, is there a certain like order of operations? Can it just be from anyone in the staff? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm going to be humorous and answer your question by yes, which I know doesn't really address it. But what I mean by that is I don't think that there is a clear order of operations. I've seen it work in both ways, where students who have that relationship, have that comfort, have that trust in themselves, or even with an individual, even if it's not a coach, to be able to express it themselves. And then, you know, I think in the right situation, that expression is heard and it is communicated to the people it needs to be communicated to, and it kind of moves through the pipeline as it's supposed to. I've also seen it be successful where coaches themselves say, look, I recognize that some things may be going on, even if I'm not the person that you need to talk to, and really doing their work, and even administrators doing the same thing for coaches, quite frankly, as that's something that has also been very much revealed to us during this time. So no specific order of operations, but I do think it's very much based on, I kind of mentioned this a little earlier, what the existing culture around having conversations like this is. You know, I would not dare tell any athlete to address their coach or address their administrators if they did not feel a sense of psychological safety or trust, that information would be tended to properly.
Of course.
And that they could trust the information would then be passed along to ensure that they can receive the care that they need to receive. At the same time, it's important to identify where to go as an athlete. And it's okay if it's not your coach. It's okay if it's not an administrator, but it is important to identify a space, a source, a person.
Absolutely.
And then for coaches and administrators, again, going back to that awareness and kind of how you show up and the influence that you have in creating that culture. And even if you recognize none of your athletes are coming to you to, again, just acknowledge, to just say like, hey, I know a lot is going on right now. And I would understand why you would not want to come tell me. Right? I think that goes a really, really long way as well. So, a number of different ways to get to the same point. I don't think any one way is better than the other or more effective than the other, as much as it's just got to fit with where your individual situation circumstances.
Absolutely. And so my next question for you is, how do we continue as, athletic departments and athletes and administrators, how do we continue to change the narrative and stigma surrounding mental health in sports as we move forward?
Yeah, there are a lot of different things we can do, and I think we're doing a lot of them. I think continuing to provide that space and that support, whether it means, like I said, having funded or established positions within the department, or it's establishing relationships with those either on campus or those outside the campus community that can provide that support, is a big step. Again, kind of normalizing the conversation, as I mentioned, using the things that we already have in place to continue to plug in that support. So one of the things that comes to mind for me is a number of different institutions have a student athlete development department. And I know that a number of those departments are including some mental health and wellness programming that even if they're not putting on themselves, they're partnering with, whether it's they have a counseling, a sports psychology person in their athletic department, or they reach out to someone on the campus counseling center. But again, that goes back to that notion of, we are infusing this into what we do to help continue to normalize it so that it does not feel like this weird, different thing that you don't feel comfortable addressing. I think there have been a number of incredibly brave, courageous, current and former student athletes that are involved in different student organizations, like Active Minds. Oh my goodness, there's a young woman that played volleyball at Southern Cal that has an organization. Her name's escaping me. The name of the organization is escaping me.
Did you play it?
The name of it, I'm actually going to look it up right here. I have it on my phone because it's something that we're looking to get more information about. But the hidden opponent, there we go. So that's an example of another student organization. Mm-hmm. But I think the combination of all those things, not only what we can do with staff and administrators and normalizing it into existing programming and conversations, but really, listening to our student athletes who are really giving us all the answers and really telling us and taking charge themselves and making some really awesome efforts. I think those two things will combine to continue to keep the ball rolling and have us continue to normalize and to increase the presence and awareness around the importance of mental health for student athletes. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just the fact that when you say mental health, so many people have, one thing that comes to mind. And unfortunately, instead of thinking of it on this spectrum, as I mentioned, that they're like mental illness, oh my goodness, something has to be terribly wrong. And all that comes with it, right? That's part of that whole stigma thing.
Right.
But I think, the two things I mentioned, coming from a student perspective and just continue to articulate it, getting active in organizations and speaking out with staff, infusing it into things from a structural perspective is really going to be the best way for us to keep this ball rolling, to grow the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's all the questions I have for you. So I just want to say thank you again for taking the time to join us today. I really respect and admire the work that you're doing. So I just want to thank you for that as well.
You are absolutely welcome. I enjoyed it.